James Paterson, welcome.
Thanks, Patricia, for having me.
You're one of the MPs who've joined this Interparliamentary Alliance on China. It's an international alliance of parliamentarians who want democratic countries to take, I suppose it's been described by one of my colleagues, Stephen Jejets, as a more muscular approach to Beijing. Why did you join?
Well, it's a fascinating and I think very important alliance, and it occurs, as you say, Patricia, at the parliamentary level. This is not a government-to-government initiative, and that's in part recognising that this is going to be an intergenerational challenge. It's not just going to be a challenge for governments or administrations of today and tomorrow, but for many years to come. I think it's really important that like-minded parliamentarians from free democracies coordinate like this because we have a lot of interests that are in common here. Our alliance includes German Greens and British Conservatives and Canadian Liberals and American Republicans and Democrats. It's a genuinely non-partisan global effort, and I think it's a really important one.
How did this global movement begin, and how was Australia approached about being part of it?
One of the precursors to this group was a joint statement signed about Hong Kong by a series of legislators a few weeks ago. That's now up to several hundred signatures from elected representatives from all around the world who responded to a campaign by a British NGO, which is dedicated to supporting the people of Hong Kong, to add their names and their voice to concerns about the Chinese Communist Party's encroachment on Hong Kong and the rights and freedoms of the people of Hong Kong. And it really, I mean, there were early discussions prior to that, but that really sparked the much broader growth of this movement. Andrew Hastie and Kimberley Kitching are the Liberal and Labor co-chairs on behalf of Australia, and were very involved in the early organisation of that, and it's grown from there.
In terms of what you hope to achieve, you say you need a global effort to deal with these challenges. What do you hope to do at an international level with MPs from across the world that you haven't been able to do when you're sort of focused on your own country's advocacy?
Well, one of the important tasks of this Interparliamentary Alliance is to remind everyone that we are not alone in facing these challenges. Sometimes in the Australian public debate, we think that we're the only country in the world that's having challenges in our dealings with the Chinese government. But in fact, it's replicated around the world, and the strength and breadth of countries signing up to this initiative is good evidence of that. We can provide moral support to each other in these causes. We can provide vocal public support to each other when these instances arise, whether it's a Swedish citizen arrested in Hong Kong for selling books, or an Australian citizen detained, or a Canadian citizen arrested, or economic coercion or trade threats against Finland or Norway. We can all band together, and I think we will be stronger together, and I think the Chinese Communist Party will think twice if it knows that in taking on one country, it won't be easy to single them out as it might have been in the past.
And New Zealand obviously is a country very close to us. Is New Zealand yet part of this?
They haven't formally signed on, but I'd be very hopeful that they would be. There's a number of parliamentarians having conversations about that right now. The criteria for membership are one representative from each major political party on each side of the spectrum in a democracy, and so we need both a New Zealand Labor and a New Zealand National MP to sign up, and if we're able to achieve that, I'm sure that they'll join.
You mentioned German Greens, I think. Do you have any Greens in Australia that have joined?
Not as yet, but they'd be very welcome to, and I recognise that the Greens in the Australian Parliament do genuinely care about human rights issues globally and have been outspoken about it in the past. In fact, in question time today, Larissa Waters, the Greens Senate leader, asked a question about it, and so we'd certainly welcome them with open arms.
In terms of this decision you've made at this point in time, of course, the relationship with China, between Australia and China, is very frosty, as you know. Is this a good time to do this? Is this a provocative act?
Well, I think the point is, Patricia, China's having testy relations with a lot of other countries in the world, and so it's exactly the time to do it, to band together. I mean, in some respects, the challenges that Australia's having with China, although serious, are nowhere near as serious as that encountered by countries like India, for example, which is engaged in a very serious border dispute with China right now, with armies facing off on a very sensitive part of the world. So in many respects, we are not alone, and I think that's exactly the time to band together with other countries who are like-minded.
We talked a little earlier about the kind of work it might be able to do in terms of giving support to each other as you try to prosecute this point around democracy. Calm Gillespie is obviously the latest person to fall victim, if you like, of laws and secrecy in China. What What work is this group doing around this? I mean, he's been essentially he's facing the death sentence, as we know. What's the group doing around that?
Look, I want to be very careful about my commentary about this case because I've seen a statement by the family today asking people not to speculate publicly about it, and the government, of course, has been very careful and very measured in its language about that. As a government, Australia has a principled opposition to the death penalty wherever it's enacted in the world, whether that's the United States or China or anywhere else, and any Australian citizen facing these circumstances would receive the full consular assistance of the government. We can, though, work through organisations like IPAC to make sure that Australia does not deal with this alone. There are Canadian citizens, for example, who have been arrested and detained under difficult circumstances in China for now about 12 months. They shouldn't feel alone, just as we shouldn't feel alone in tackling these issues.
As the chair of the Parliament's Finance Committee, you've warned Australia's big banks against backing new Chinese national security legislation aimed at stamping out dissent in Hong Kong. That's in order, of course, to keep their licences in the financial hub. Have you spoken directly with the banks?
No, I haven't, but I look forward to the opportunity to do so through the committee in the coming weeks and months ahead. My comments were in response to the intervention of HSBC, a British bank based in Hong Kong, into this debate. It followed coercion, open coercion by Communist Party officials saying if HSBC didn't get on board with the Hong Kong security law, then it could lose its business in China. I don't want to see any Australian bank put in that position. I think the most appropriate and respectful thing for them to do is to stay out of the debate on that issue, to not intervene in that debate in support or opposition. That's the safest thing for them to do in terms of their business in Asia and elsewhere in the world, and also in terms of their brand here in Australia, because I think many Australians would be troubled if they entered into the debate on the side of the Chinese Communist Party.
Are you concerned that corporates are doing too much of that already, that we're seeing corporates obviously very much hedging bets, worried about their relationships and that they have been compromised to a certain extent?
I respect the desire of most companies to stay out of politics, whether it's here in Australia or elsewhere in the world. And certainly being involved in politics in a place like China is much, much more difficult than it is in Australia, where we do have a free and open democracy. I understand why companies are very reticent to do that, and that's a completely respectable, acceptable position for a company to take. What would be a problem is if they departed from that position and did start to enter into debates in support of the Chinese Communist Party's positions in Hong Kong, which are highly international contentious, which breach the Sino-British Declaration from 1997.
Senator, have you had any discussions before you participated in this or formed the group with the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister?
Look, I don't want to go too much into private conversations with colleagues. All I would say is that generally we do observe the normal processes for that. We certainly give heads up to any ministers if we're going to say something publicly and enter into those things. But at the end of the day, we are individual parliamentarians, and particularly in the Liberal Party, who jealously guard our intellectual freedom and our freedom to speak out when we think it's appropriate.
Thanks so much for